1992 marked 500 years since colonizers first invaded what is now known as the Americas and waged a campaign of genocide, displacement, and extraction against the peoples indigenous to those lands. Though this history is often taught to American children as some sort of mutually beneficial cultural exchange, it has in fact been among the most violent and disenfranchising processes in human history. Overlooked along with this historical revisionism is the fact that those centuries of violence have also been centuries of indigenous resistance. And contrary to what many of those in power would have us believe, the indigenous peoples of this land are still here and still fighting. This is working class history.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
Before we get started, if you're wondering who I am and why I don't have a British accent, I apologize. I'm Tyler Hill, and I've been helping John and Matt produce this podcast since it first started in 2018. Going forward, I'll occasionally be hosting episodes too. And just a reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work, and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes without ads, bonus episodes, free and discounted merchandise, and other content. For example, our Patreon supporters can listen to both parts of this double episode without ads now. Join us or find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. First published in 1992, Gord Hill's 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance has long served as an accessible account of an often overlooked but vitally important resistance movement. It is one of the most popular titles in our online store, with good reason. Gord has also released an updated version as a graphic novel. Over the next two episodes, we'll talk to Gord about the movements which have arisen since 1992 when the book ends, looking at resistance since it came out. But it's worth noting that this topic is simply too big to cover comprehensively in a podcast. And any one of these stories or movements could easily be a podcast or miniseries on its own. We hope to produce standalone episodes about some of these movements in the future, but for now, like Gord's book, we hope these episodes serve as a helpful overview and introduction to Indigenous resistance in the Americas since 1992.
My name's Gord Hill. I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw, and I'm currently living in Alert Bay, British Columbia, in Canada. In 1992, of course, was the 500-year mark of the discovery and the invasion of the Americas. And there were like a lot of official kind of celebrations of this. I think they were stronger in South and Central America. There were much larger, more powerful social movements that were challenging this narrative. And in North America, there were a few locations that you saw kind of opposition to official celebrations. I was actually in San Francisco in October 1992, and there was a fairly large mobilization against one of these kind of celebrations where they had replicas of one or more of the ships that Columbus had sailed to the Caribbean on. I don't know if the Pinta, the Maria, the Santa Maria. So there was a fairly large protest and like a few days of a gathering. These were organized by the American Indian Movement and some of their allies. And so we marched. One day we had marched, and we were kind of confronted by riot police. There was small street fighting that occurred. But yeah, I mean, that was just one incident. I think overall, social movements were trying to challenge this official narrative that this was a mutually beneficial meeting of two worlds, like the European and the American indigenous peoples. Both sides kind of benefited, and despite the disease epidemics, and they just really minimized the violence and the genocide of colonization. So I think that's where, the major opposition arose to these types of these official celebrations and that were occurring. One of the things about the 500 years of resistance, 500 years of the invasion of the Americas, that time mark for me, and I think a lot of other indigenous peoples and other peoples here in for North America, South America, Central America, was like kind of like a reflection of what had occurred in the previous 500 years, and just kind of looking back at the history. And it really motivated me to really research and try to learn that history, because I wanted to have a fuller understanding of how did we come to be in the situation we are in today. And of course, that's the real value of history, is it can show you how this process occurred. And so for me, it was a big event, a big time, because I really researched the history of colonization, Indigenous resistance to colonization, and it really helped me understand the bigger historical process that had occurred.
Gord had started publishing a newspaper a year or two prior called Otoken in response to the Oka Crisis of 1990. The Oka Crisis was a standoff between a group of Mohawk people and Canadian authorities in Quebec after settlers attempted to build a golf course on one of the last remaining parcels of sacred Mohawk grounds, including a meeting place and a centuries-old cemetery. Over the course of a 78-day standoff from July through September, a group of about 3,000 Indigenous warriors fought off nearly twice as many Canadian police and military troops. In the end, there was one fatality on each side, about 30 injured police and military, and 75 injured activists, including the 14-year-old Wanique Horn Miller, who was stabbed in the chest by a soldier with a bayonet as she carried her 4-year-old half-sister. She would later go on to be an Olympic water polo player, and the first Mohawk woman from Canada to ever compete in the Olympics. There were also mass arrests of land protectors as the standoff ended, many of whom were beaten while in custody. Journalists covering the land protectors were also arrested. The development of the golf course did not go through, and the land was purchased by the Canadian government. However, the Canadian government did not establish the land as a reserve, nor has it ever been transferred back to the Mohawk people. Despite this disappointment, the fact remained that a vastly outnumbered group of activists had successfully fought off the Canadian government. The resistance inspired Indigenous people across Canada to be more involved with direct action, and is considered a turning point in Indigenous resistance by many, including Gord Hill, who had previously been mostly involved in anarchist, anti-fascist, and anti-racist movements. After Oka, he was inspired to learn more about Indigenous resistance and to get more involved. He started publishing in Otoken, which is where 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance was first published. The newspaper continued until around 1994.
New Year's Day in 1994, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation launched its offensive in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas. And they were a predominantly Indigenous resistance movement, an armed resistance movement. They had been organizing in Chiapas in the Lacandan jungle for well over a decade. I think the early organizers had moved into that region in the mid-1970s. They were the remnants of early guerrilla groups that had been harshly repressed by the Mexican state. And they had moved into the Chiapas region and they began making connections. So this was a very long-term process of establishing themselves and building these networks and eventually building their armed formations. And I had actually been in Mexico City in 1989. I went down there after the San Francisco anarchist gathering. I'd met some Mexican comrades and I went down to Mexico City. And even then, it was really common hear rumors about the guerrillas in the mountains. And I didn't really understand what they were talking about. And then a few years later, of course, we had the New Year's Day Rebellion carried out by the Zapatistas. And they had captured a number of towns and then faced the reaction from the Mexican military. So this was a very profound rebellion. It had occurred in kind of like the aftermath of the collapse of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of armed guerrilla groups around the world had basically laid down their arms because of this new kind of political situation. You know, there was no longer a Soviet Union who had actually helped fund and supported a lot of these movements. And so there was kind of a real demoralization, I would say, among the left in general. The capitalists were running around triumphant and, kind of celebrating the demise of this so-called communist regime. So the Zapatista Rebellion was like a very uplifting action. They kind of revitalized, I think, the left in a lot of ways. And they also had a big influence on the left and kind of oriented everybody to, the concept of globalization and neoliberalism, because, they timed their uprising to coincide with the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and just generally the free flow of capital without any restrictions or regulations. And so that was going to have a big impact on people in Mexico, especially a lot of farmers, indigenous peoples. It was going to revise a lot of the land codes. And so that was, why they timed it for that day. And then, of course, the Zapatistas, they withstood the Mexican counteroffensive, and they are very strongly embedded in the indigenous communities in southern Chiapas. They established autonomous forms of self-governance in these communities. They established healthcare facilities, education, communications through radios, radio networks. All this infrastructure they built up, and they actually outperformed the Mexican state, in healthcare and education. And they still exist to this day, the Zapatistas, as a social movement with all this infrastructure in Chiapas. So they had a very profound effect on Mexican society. And I think internationally, they hosted a lot of large international gatherings. They were one of the first movements to kind of really start using the internet. They had a very influential spokesperson, Subcomandante Marcos, who was very eloquent. He wasn't an indigenous person, but he was a very eloquent speaker. So they had a really big impact. And the fact that they were an indigenous movement as well was pretty significant. So yeah, they had a big impact when they first arose.
The Zapatista Army of National Liberation, named after famous Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata, launched a truly grassroots peasant revolt against the Mexican state. On January 1, 1994, about 3,000 armed Zapatistas occupied 6 towns in the Chiapas. Their demands centered on work, land, housing, food, healthcare, education, independence, liberty, democracy, justice, and peace. As Gord said, they timed their rebellion to coincide with the signing of NAFTA, a symbol of many of the neoliberal policies that disenfranchised their indigenous communities and negatively affected many throughout the country. They're staunchly anti-racist and anti-colonial, and the movement has been heavily shaped by the women involved. About 1/3 of the Zapatista National Liberation Army was made up of women, and they've redefined gender roles, dedicating themselves over time to dismantling patriarchy. They reappropriated ranches and still occupy an autonomous zone to this day, and have a highly sophisticated horizontal autonomous network of governance and communication. They were able to forge their own path rooted in cultural tradition and the needs of their communities. Their ideology is a unique blend of Maya tradition, anarchism, Marxism, and Catholic liberation theology. They're seen by many as an example of what a successful indigenous sovereignty movement could look like. They've influenced grassroots movements around the world, and they've broadened the possibilities of what a world after capitalism could look like. And it didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of steady organizing.
There's interviews with those early organizers who were Marxists. I think they were mostly urban. Maybe they had gone down into Chiapas, and they talked about this process of how they began to work with the indigenous peoples there. And so their traditional forms of these Marxist guerrilla formations that were spread throughout Central and South America in the 60s, the 70s, and through the 80s, the Zapatistas kind of broke with that. And I think, the biggest reason for that was because they're working with these indigenous communities who didn't want to accept these kind of orthodox Marxist forms of organizing with the party and all this type of stuff. So it was a significant change from what we'd seen prior to the Zapatistas with the different armed groups. And I think it was like the Marxist organizers who went down there were kind of like indigenized to a certain extent and had to, they had to learn a lot about the indigenous culture in order to work with these indigenous communities. And I think that's why they came out as a very different type of movement. They weren't just like these Marxist intellectuals who now recruited indigenous foot soldiers to carry out this revolutionary struggle. They were these Marxist organizers who became aligned with indigenous communities and community organizers, and they came up with a new forms of organization to carry out these struggles. And so they're very embedded in the communities, and Then they had their own, they had a political organization and the armed organization. It was like an evolution of these Marxist revolutionary armed groups that we'd seen in the past, and how it was adopted to an indigenous movement.
Further north, Gord also told us about the 1995 standoff at Gustafsen Lake. The conflicts grew out of an annual Sundance ceremony that was held near the lake by the Secwepemc people. The site was part of their sacred ancestral lands and had never been ceded to the Canadian government and never handed over in a treaty. The Secwepemc had an agreement with a rancher who used the land for grazing his cattle, as long as they agreed not to build any permanent structures on it. When they built a fence to keep the cows from the site, the rancher asked them to leave, and they refused, saying that to interrupt a Sundance ceremony before it was complete was not something they could do.
In the summer of 1995, we had a couple of pretty significant confrontations in Canada between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state security forces. The first one that occurred was in the south central interior region of British Columbia, and it was involving the Secwepemc people, who were previously known as the Shuswap. So the Secwepemc people had a Sundance camp near 100 Mile House, which is a small rural town. So this is a very rural area, and they'd had a Sundance camp there for many years. And there was an American rancher, Lyle James, who brought his cattle out to graze on these what are called crown lands, which is lands that are claimed by the government. So he would have his cattle out there grazing, and he ended up getting into a conflict with this Secwepemc group who had their Sundance camp, and the cattle were trespassing in there. And anyway, this conflict started to grow, and Lyle James had his cowboys go in there into the camp, and they were threatening these native people. And by this point, it was just a family, an elder and his family. So the elder made a call for warriors to come and defend this camp. So warriors from the Secwepemc and some of their allies went there, and it eventually became this very large armed standoff in which the BC provincial government, which is a new Democratic Party, which is kind of like the Social Democratic Party, supposedly left-leaning and whatnot. So they deployed over 450 heavily armed police. They're mostly emergency response teams from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They acquired military assistance in the form of 8 or 9 Bison armored personnel carriers, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and C7 assault rifles. So the RCMP closed off the area and basically laid siege to the camp.
As the standoff escalated, the Sundancers refused to leave until their rights to the unceded land were recognized, and they said they were willing to die for their land. The RCMP sent in 400 officers and an emergency response team who used camouflage to try and conduct reconnaissance on the camp. Though the campers reiterated their desire for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, security forces used violence.
There was a number of shooting incidents, the most significant of which occurred on September 11th, 1995. So, during these situations, the negotiations are going on. The RCMP cut off all communications from the camp, so they couldn't actually communicate with the media or anybody outside of that area. So the public was fed strictly the RCMP and the government version of events.
With communication to and from the outside world cut off, the RCMP's skewed version of events became the only narrative, and unsurprisingly mischaracterized the campers as, quote, terrorists, militants, criminals, and thugs. Ujjal Dosanjh, the Attorney General of British Columbia at the time, said, quote, "Where's the other side of the story? There's only one side of the story. There is no other side," end quote. Highlighting the way the media's portrayal of the standoff obscured the real grievances at the heart of the issue, namely their claim to the unceded land.
On September 11th, there was the police laid an explosive charge across a road that was used by the defenders to go access a lake so they could get fresh water and bathe and whatnot. And this was part of a no shooting zone that had been agreed upon between the defenders and the police. So one morning, September 11th, as this vehicle was driving down the road, the RCMP carried out this ambush, in which they detonated an explosive charge that they'd laid across the road. It blew up the truck. It was so powerful, it blew the engine block out of the truck. The batteries and that were found hundreds of yards away. Amazingly, the two occupants in the vehicle escaped unharmed. They began fleeing from the vehicle. And shortly after the explosive charge, one of those Bison armored personnel carriers moved out of the tree line onto the road, smashed into the vehicle, which was obviously badly damaged from the explosion. The police left the armored personnel vehicle and began firing on the occupants who were fleeing for their lives. They shot and killed a dog that was in the vehicle. And that afternoon, there was a hours-long firefight, the police firing tens of thousands of rounds. They chased the Secwepemc elder known as Wolverine. They chased him with this Bison armored vehicle, and he returned fire with an AK-47 and disabled the Bison armored personnel carrier. So the police had to call in additional armored vehicles to rescue those police who were trapped in this armored vehicle. The next day, I believe there was, again, in a no firing zone, there was a lone defender walking down to a lake. He was unarmed, carrying a towel. He's going to go bathe or whatever. And a RCMP sniper team opened fire on him and later claimed that he was seen to be wearing camouflage uniform and carrying a weapon. So after the standoff ended, it was about a month long. The defenders eventually laid down their arms and came out of the camp and were all arrested. And there was a year-long criminal trial that occurred in Surrey, BC, which is a suburb of Vancouver. And during the trial, all this information came out about how the RCMP had conducted what they themselves called a smear and disinformation campaign. In fact, the main media liaison person for the RCMP, Sergeant Peter Montague, described it as a smear and disinformation campaign, and that they'd learned everything from the FBI and how to carry out these types of counterinsurgency propaganda campaigns. But anyway, in that trial, it came out the RCMP had actually videotaped this entire siege because they wanted to use it as a training aid for future confrontations. So all this stuff was videotaped, 24-hour surveillance of the area of this conflict. And so this was obtained by the Defense Council, and they clearly showed these incidents, the September 11th ambush and the September 12th sniper attack contradicted everything that the RCMP had said about these incidents. And it just really revealed the disinformation that the RCMP had engaged in. And so this was a really significant armed conflict that occurred, had a big impact on Indigenous peoples in the province of British Columbia.
In Canada, the standoff is still seen to this day as an example of excessive force by militarized police. And though people both inside and outside of the Indigenous community have called for a public inquiry into the legality of the RCMP's actions, the government has refused. For Gord, this struggle marked a sea change in the attitude of many First Nations peoples.
During the 1995 Gustafsen Lake standoff, I wasn't there at the standoff. I was actually born in 100 Mile House, and nobody had ever heard of it until after this standoff. So then I could say, oh yeah, I was born in 100 Mile House, and they'd like, oh really, that's where that standoff occurred. But I was involved in solidarity work in Vancouver during that time. And one of the things that I really saw then was how profound the government and police propaganda was. So a lot of Native people at that time were actually opposed to the standoff. They didn't support the defenders at all. And this was because of the propaganda that was being put out by the government, which totally demonized the Secwepemc armed defenders, completely undermined their sovereignty position that they adopted, which most Indigenous peoples in the province would generally support, the lack of treaties here and whatnot. But after the year-long trial and the exposing of the RCMP's smear and disinformation campaign, just seeing like the turn in a lot of Indigenous communities to now supporting the armed resistance that occurred at Gustafsen Lake. And so that was really profound for me to see how a movement, they can be demonized and all this propaganda against them, and there's not much public support for them. But over time, it can be turned, and then you'll see a reversal of these positions. So that was an important lesson for me.
Another land dispute in Canada that took place around the same time was the occupation of Ipperwash Park by members of the Stony Point Ojibwe Band.
In early September, there was another confrontation that occurred in southern Ontario at Ipperwash Provincial Park. So this was a community, it was known as Stony Point. They had, during World War II, they had been forcibly evicted from their reserve land and relocated to a nearby reserve, Kettle Point. The Stony Point Reserve was taken and transformed into a military base to train soldiers for World War II. The Army had said, we'll return this land to you after the war ends, and of course that never occurred. So for decades, the Stony Pointers, as they were known, were campaigning and petitioning the government to get their reserve land back. And in the early 1990s, they moved into the military base. They set up a small camp with a teepee and tents and whatnot, and they began occupying this area. And in 1995, they expanded their occupation into the Ipperwash Provincial Park, which was also a part of their reserve land that had been taken by the government. And at this time, there was a Conservative Party was the provincial government under Bob Harris, I think his name was. So he had directed the Ontario Provincial Police to go in and clear out these natives. And that's what they did. The Ontario Provincial Police, the OPP, sent in a couple hundred police. They sent in a riot squad.
The camp was made up of about 35 people. When the Ontario Police sent in a riot squad and a SWAT team, they beat and arrested Cecil Bernard George as he tried to peacefully approach them, and a battle broke out.
On September 5th, they went in. They tried to clear the encampment that was in the park. Now, they were accompanied by TRU unit. I think it stands for Tactics and Rescue Unit, which was their version of a SWAT team or emergency response team. These got heavily armed. So they had gone in. There was a confrontation that occurred with the riot police. Police opened fire. They fired over 1,000 rounds. Okay, and this was a completely unarmed action being carried out by the Stony Pointers. They were militant. They confronted the riot police, but they were unarmed. So in this shooting, the police shot and killed Dudley George, who was one of the organizers of the occupation. This was a big confrontation, had a big impact on Indigenous peoples across Canada. And so these were two pretty significant events. They were this type of militancy was kind of the result of the 1990 Oka crisis, which basically set the tone for Indigenous resistance throughout the 90s and even up until this day. That was how big an impact the Oka crisis had. But those are the two main conflicts that occurred in 1995.
The protesters had banned weapons from the camp, but that didn't stop the police from making false claims that they had seen weapons. The notoriously trigger-happy sergeant who murdered Dudley was named Kenneth Dean, and he claimed to have mistaken a tree branch for a gun, despite only standing a few feet away. Dudley's injuries could have been treated and he would have survived if his brother and sister had been able to take him to the hospital. But as they tried to do so, they were arrested. Sergeant Dean was convicted of criminal negligence causing death, but suffered no real consequences besides some community service. In 2009, the Ontario government finally signed over control of the park, along with 95 million Canadian dollars, to the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. In British Columbia in 2000, members of the St'át'imc Nation, together with supporters, set up a permanent camp near the Cayush mountain range in an attempt to prevent construction of a $500 million ski resort. The camp was named Shutika after the St'át'imc winter spirit of the region. After 2 decades of continuous occupation, plans for the resort were scrapped, and the area remains today reclaimed native land. Another movement which emerged in the early 2000s was the 2004 Save the Peaks Coalition. The group was formed to address environmental and human rights issues in response to the Arizona Snow Bowl's attempt to develop a ski resort on the San Francisco Peaks, which is sacred land both spiritually and culturally for at least 13 nearby tribes. The project proposed clearing 30,000 trees, some of which were on land that was home to threatened species. Developers also wanted to run an almost 15-mile underground pipeline through the area that would transport 180 million gallons of wastewater per ski season for artificial snow. Indigenous activists have been protesting the development for decades, conducting actions like chaining themselves to construction equipment in 2011, leading to 28 arrests. Court cases have consistently been decided in favor of the developers and the U.S. Forest Service, though resistance continues, and activists continue to appeal and try to move their case up through the court system. Meanwhile, in 2008, opposition began to a pipeline planned by the Enbridge Corporation.
The Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline was a proposed pipeline that would go from the tar sands in Alberta and carry crude oil to a terminal that was going to be built on the west coast, I think near Kitimat or Prince Rupert, Kitimat, British Columbia. And so this was a proposal, began in the early 2000s, and it generated a lot of opposition from people along that route, which was in northern British Columbia, and especially from Indigenous peoples who were really opposed to this pipeline. And in fact, it was unprecedented, the amount of mobilization that occurred among Indigenous peoples, because you had grassroots Indigenous peoples as well as band councils opposed to this pipeline because of the dangers that a crude oil pipeline presented to the environment. And as this campaign continued, and as Northern Enbridge was going through the regulatory processes of trying to get the necessary permits to start construction on this pipeline, there was a big campaign against the tar sands in Alberta because of the massive environmental impact that it had, that it was having, the destruction of the environment that was occurring, and the dangers of this heavy crude oil being transported by pipelines and then container ships. Because on the coast of British Columbia, we'd already had a fairly significant oil spill. I think it was in the 1990s, and it was along northern British Columbia and southern Alaskan coast. And it was a tanker that had run aground or had a big spill, and it contaminated large sections of the beach, and it really impacted the environment there. So people were keenly aware of the dangers of not just the pipelines, but also these massive container ships that they wanted to have transport the crude out of this terminal in Kitimat. So there was this massive opposition began to build. Then we had, I can't remember the exact year, but there was in the Gulf of Mexico, the BP oil spill, which was a drilling platform that just ruptured. I don't know if there was an explosion, but it just started spewing massive amounts of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, I believe. And so this went on for months. And so this also contributed to the opposition here in British Columbia to this proposed pipeline and terminal. And so it was unprecedented. The thousands of Indigenous peoples were marching. And this is an area of British Columbia which we had never really seen any significant movement by Native peoples. So it was very, very significant. And eventually, the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline was scrapped. So this was a big victory for Indigenous peoples, for environmental movements, different social movements that really opposed this pipeline.
The Keystone XL pipeline was also first proposed in 2008, and a few years later, around 2011, public opposition to the pipeline started to coalesce. After repeated delays in their environmental impact report, the Barack Obama administration's State Department, led by Hillary Clinton, announced the pipeline would have limited environmental impact, despite the fact that it was planned to go through major sources of fresh water. In August and September of 2011, protesters stood outside the White House for 2 weeks, and about 1,000 people were arrested. Under pressure, the Obama administration would eventually veto the pipeline in 2015, citing climate, drinking water, public health, and the ecosystems of the local communities as their reasons. But in 2017, Donald Trump reversed the veto and signed an executive order to advance the project, as well as another controversial pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, which we'll get to later. Trump also granted the Canada-based developers the cross-border permits that had been stalling the pipeline. But on Joe Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order finally ending the project for good. Across the border in Canada, Wet'suwet'en land protectors started organizing as well around the same time, in efforts which culminated years later.
The Wet'suwet'en campaign against pipelines actually began 2010, at least 2011. The Wet'suwet'en were initially kind of mobilizing themselves against the Northern Gateway Pipeline, part of that big mobilization. But then when the Northern Gateway Pipeline was canceled, another pipeline was proposed which was now going to be a natural gas pipeline. As opposed to crude oil coming from the tar sands, this was going to be a natural gas pipeline coming from natural gas, actually shale rock formations in northeastern British Columbia, which are accessed by fracking. So they began to organize. The Unistoten clan of the Wet'suwet'en built a cabin. At first, they built a cabin in the direct path of the pipeline. They began kind of building a network and organizing and then expanding this camp. They built a number of other structures and actually built a very large provincial and then national solidarity network based around opposing this pipeline. And they would have annual gatherings on their territory at this camp, and they called them action camps. And that's when they would do a lot of construction of new structures. They had a blockade of the access road into their camp, into the area. And then in 2018, I think this pipeline thing went on for many years with, they're going through the regulatory process and all that. And then I think finally 2018 or 2019, they actually began construction of the pipeline into the Wet'suwet'en territory. But before they got to the Unistoten territory, they ran into the Gidimt'en territory, which is another clan of the Unistoten. So the Gidimt'en were always in solidarity with the Unistoten. But as this construction entered the Gidimt'en territory, they began blockades and direct action to stop the construction. And that's when we had the big Shutdown Canada kind of mobilization occur, because the police were going in and raiding this camp of the Gidimt'en, dismantling their blockades and arresting people.
After an attack by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on the Unistoten camp, a call went out to hashtag Shutdown Canada in solidarity. Across the country, Indigenous peoples and supporters started a wave of disruption of key transport and logistics networks. Blockades went up on freight railway lines, and protesters picketed ports, like the Port of Vancouver, which were shut down when union dock workers refused to cross. Bridges and roads were blockaded in Vancouver, and blockades were set up in other First Nations territories, from Quebec to British Columbia. The disruption was estimated to be costing $425 million a day, and businesses began to complain of an economic catastrophe.
Kind of unprecedented in terms of solidarity with Indigenous movements in Canada, because there was a lot of direct actions occurring, targeting economic infrastructure like ports and railways and highways across the country. And this was the result of years of organizing by the Unistoten clan. And so this was a very, very significant mobilization. And then we had other actions in the Gidimt'en territory. Maybe 2022, there was a major sabotage action of a work camp of the pipeline. 20 or so masked individuals entered the work site, told the security, there was a handful of security there. There was no workers. I don't think there was that many workers at the site, but they were all told to, vacate the site. And then these heavy machinery was commandeered and used to dismantle and destroy other machinery and infrastructure in this camp, causing millions of dollars in damage. So a very significant act of sabotage was carried out against the pipeline construction. And anyway, now today we've had a number of the cases are going through the courts, and I believe the pipeline is mostly completed now. So I think that's what is occurring now.
Also in 2011, a mass student protest movement took root in Chile, during which Indigenous Mapuche peoples played a key role. Students, teachers, and other education workers took to the streets to call for comprehensive reform of the entire Chilean education system. Their demands included enshrining education as a fundamental right in the Chilean constitution and increasing access to education for marginalized Chileans. They called for new financing systems and income equality for teachers, better transportation infrastructure, and overall a more democratized educational system. Their demands also included an educational system that acknowledged the educational and linguistics rights of the Indigenous peoples, and they called for more education in Indigenous languages, more scholarships for Indigenous students, more curricula covering Indigenous issues, and legal recognition of Indigenous homelands. In June 2012, they organized a student strike, and 150,000 people marched through the streets of Santiago. The protesters' demands have not been entirely met, but they contributed to a major shift in public perception and have successfully secured proposals for things like education funds. The Chilean Senate's Education Committee has also passed a bill prohibiting state support of for-profit educational institutions, which was one of the protesters' main demands. 2011 also saw indigenous rights protests in Bolivia in opposition to the construction of a major highway through a national park in indigenous territory that was the ancestral homeland of 12,000 indigenous people from multiple tribes. During the demonstrations, over 1,700 people, among them pregnant women and children, set off on a march of 375 miles, or 526 kilometers, from Trinidad to the nation's capital of La Paz. At one point, protesters got a hold of Foreign Minister David Choquehuanca and forced him into the march with them in order to get through a police checkpoint. The protesters were subject to police violence, tear gas, and mass arrests, but also sparked solidarity protests across the country. The demonstrations also included a relatively successful attempt at a general strike. Protesters did things like set barricades on fire to de-arrest their comrades, and miners even took to setting off dynamite. Though the march was broken up a couple times, they continued to reconvene, and in October of 2011, they made it to La Paz. By the end, there were tens of thousands of protesters. One of the key issues at the center of the protests was Evo Morales' continued support of the highway project. Despite being the first indigenous president of Bolivia, he lost major support amongst the indigenous activists who had propelled him to office. He discredited the protesters, calling them, quote, enemies of the nation, and accusing them of being agents of U.S. imperialism. He was eventually forced to cancel the highway construction, but not before his local reputation had taken a major blow. One broader issue which spans the history of all these movements is that of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
In Canada, there was a pretty big movement that began to emerge around the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I think one of the spearheads for it occurred in Vancouver, coming out of the downtown east side of Vancouver, because there was dozens of Indigenous women that were going missing, and not just Indigenous women, but primarily Indigenous women going missing. And so there was a movement started by Indigenous women in the downtown east side. And one of the things that they began to do was every February 14th, which is Valentine's Day, they would hold a memorial march for all these missing women. Also missing murdered women who'd been murdered in the downtown east side, whose bodies were found and whatnot. So this movement began to emerge, I think, in the mid 2000s, maybe even earlier, with these annual rallies. So these rallies began to get bigger and bigger. First, there was just dozens of people participating, then hundreds, and then thousands of people would participate in these marches. And then there was the arrest of Robert Pickton, who was a pig farmer located just outside of Vancouver in the Coquitlam area, I believe it was. He was eventually charged and convicted for murdering 6 women. They found the DNA of another, I think, 26 women or something on his property. So he was a serial killer that came into the downtown east side and targeted poor, impoverished, and predominantly Indigenous women, and would bring them back to his place and then murder them. So this was a pretty profound case. He claimed to have killed close to 50 women, but as I mentioned, he was only charged and convicted for 6 murders. So he was sentenced to life in prison. Actually, just a few days ago, he was actually attacked in the prison he's being held in Quebec. He was stabbed in the head with a broom handle or something. So this was a big case, but it really propelled the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women into the national spotlight. So a lot of attention was focused on this issue. And then people in other cities across Canada were looking, and they all have cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. You look at Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, they all have cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. It became like a national movement, and it still exists to this day.
Police said they believed that the bodies of 2 Indigenous victims of Pickton were in a landfill, but they said they would not look for them, as it would be too expensive. Given the amounts of money Canadian authorities spent on repressing Indigenous protests, not to mention the huge costs of murder investigations into victims seen as, quote, worthy, who are usually white, the hypocrisy of this was clear. After extensive protests led by Indigenous people, this changed.
In Winnipeg, there was just recently elected, in 2023, there was an Indigenous man elected as premier of the province. And so he stated that they are going to search the landfill. I mean, this is like over a year later. And then months and months after this new premier has been elected and said that they're going to search the landfill, and still there's been no search conducted.
In the U.S., a 2016 study from the National Crime Information Center documented reports of 5,712 missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. The murder rate of women living on reservations is 10 times higher than the national average, despite Indigenous people making up only 2% of the overall population. And murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women in the U.S. Racist tropes and stereotypes contribute to this issue continuing to be overlooked by the media and government.
I would just add also, every city has missing and murdered women. In the United States, you'll find predominantly Black women that have been missing and murdered. In Central and South America, you have tens of thousands of women, predominantly Indigenous women, poor women, that are missing and murdered. I think it's really endemic in this society. Here in Canada, we have social movements that have emerged around this issue, but it's really a very large issue, I would say, around the world, with patriarchal and misogynistic violence being inflicted on women. I think it really speaks to just how deranged and sick this Western society is. Claiming to be all about humanity and we're civilized people and all this stuff, but when you scratch the surface, I mean, in Mexico, just everywhere, Guatemala, I mean, it's a much broader issue than just missing murdered Indigenous women in Canada. I think it's a very big problem in every Western society. I think you have this issue, but it definitely had a big impact in Canada as this movement arose, and it brought a lot of attention to, the issues Indigenous peoples face as a result of the legacies of the residential schools and why a lot of Indigenous peoples end up in these impoverished kind of urban ghettos where they're vulnerable to these types of predators. And it also really put a lot of attention on the incompetence of the police in their investigations, how they didn't really care about these women because they were just seen as almost disposable. They're poor, impoverished. There was actually one of the police investigators sometime in the 1990s, he had brought up that his theory was that there was a serial killer operating in the downtown east side, and he was dismissed by senior police and government officials as, this was not the case at all. And so his theory eventually turned out to be true. And actually right now there's an ongoing criminal trial in Winnipeg of a far-right white supremacist who's been charged with the murder of 4 Indigenous women from last year, 2023. He's going through the trial right now. He killed these women. He preyed on them. He went to a homeless shelter in Winnipeg, and that's where he targeted these women and eventually brought them back to his place and killed them there, and then dismembered them and disposed of their body parts in the garbage. So his case is going on right now, and there was actually a movement that arose in Winnipeg demanding that the provincial government and the police search the landfill, the garbage dump, to find the rest of these remnants of these women. So this is an ongoing thing. It wasn't just one serial killer. We have multiple serial killers operating in Canada, and this one in particular is a white supremacist that intentionally targeted Indigenous women. So the prosecution is actually laid out that their case is that he targeted these women because they were Indigenous.
In 2017, activists designated May 5th as a National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls, to serve as a regular focus for action. Protests highlighting the issue and demanding action have taken place across North America. For example, in October 2023, over 100 students walked out of class from Washington High School in South Dakota and held a rally in a nearby park. In general, although much of the media representation of Indigenous protests is misleading and negative, Gord is encouraged by the shift in public opinion of Native struggle. He also reflects on his own involvement in the movements over the years.
Oka 1990, I wasn't involved in the armed resistance there, but I was engaged in solidarity work again. But just seeing the high level of solidarity across Canada with this armed resistance in which a police officer was shot and killed. And despite this, there was a fairly high level of support, solidarity across the country, not just from Indigenous peoples, which was massive, but among non-Indigenous peoples. And it shows to me that there's a significant level of sympathy among the non-Indigenous population for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous struggles. And that's a very important lesson as well. I mean, I was involved with the Native youth movement from about 1997 till the early 2000s. The Native youth movement in Vancouver was kind of a direct result of the Gustafsen Lake standoff. And it really radicalized a lot of the youth in Vancouver, the Indigenous youth, and kind of radicalized the Native youth movement to really focus on, land struggles, sovereignty. And so it was Native youth movement members went on to be involved in occupations against the BC Treaty Commission that I participated in, blockades, defending fishers, asserting their sovereignty in the Chiam First Nation. Members of the Native youth movement participated in the Burnt Church resistance, again asserting the Mi'kmaq fisheries.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
That's all we've got time for in this episode. Join us in part 2, where we talk about Indigenous land defenders in Latin America, more resistance to pipelines and climate change, and elements of cultural and linguistic resistance. Part 2 is available now for early listening for our Patreon supporters. It is only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted merch, and more. And if you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. If you'd like to learn more about the past 32 years of Indigenous resistance, check out the webpage for this episode where you'll find images, a full list of sources, further reading, and more. You can also get Gord's book, 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance, and you can get 10% off it and anything else using the discount code WCHPodcast. Links in the show notes. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, and Jeremy Cusimano. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by me, Tyler Hill. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening.
Partigiano, portami via. Oh bella ciao, 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 ciao.